Hello, everyone. Welcome to CSCN 1001, Computer and Network Security. This is Dr. Amr El-Mogi. In the last lecture, we took a little bit of a history introduction into cryptography, and we said that we are going to continue with our discussion of cryptography for the first, let's say, two-thirds of the course or so. And so today we are actually done with our history lesson, and we will start discussing modern day encryption and cryptography algorithms, starting with today's lecture, which will be a type of encryption algorithm which is called block ciphers. In today's lecture, the goal is that, first of all, we will get an introduction into the two main types of cryptography algorithms and how they are applied. We will also discuss some attack types on encryption algorithms. And we will then turn our attention to block ciphers. We'll understand what block ciphers are and what are the building blocks of block ciphers. And then we will focus on the block cipher that is in commercial use right now, which is called the AES algorithm or the Advanced Encryption Standard. Okay. We start with classifying cryptography algorithms. There are actually many ways to classify them. You can classify encryption algorithms according to the amount of data that they take as input, the size of the key that they use, the complexity of the algorithm. There are actually many ways, but the most standardized way and the most well-known and the most important way to classify cryptography algorithms is by the key that is used and how this key is used. In particular, we actually have two main types of cryptography algorithms. One is called symmetric cryptography or symmetric encryption, and the other one is called public key or asymmetric encryption. Public key cryptography has actually a very wide variety of uses, such as authentication, such as digital signature, as well as exchanging keys, as well as also regular encryption. Symmetric encryption, on the other hand, is just for encryption, just for actually encrypting data. And this is the one that we are going to start our discussion with. Basically, in symmetric encryption, you have your data, which we call plain text. You feed this data as input to your encryption algorithm. Okay. For example, the encryption algorithm can be DES, which is the one that was used from the 1970s until the late 1990s, and then it got outdated and replaced by the AES algorithm, which we will study. So you feed your plain text to the encryption algorithm together with a key. Okay, the key has a fixed size. Let's say it has a number of bits, n bits, for example. This key, K, is the one that is fed also together with the plain text to the encryption algorithm to produce the encrypted text, which we call the ciphertext. So the ciphertext is a function of two things. It's a function of the plain text and is a function of the key as well. Meaning that if you change the plain text or you change the key, you will end up with a different ciphertext. Okay. Now, this ciphertext is the one that is sent from sender to the receiver. How will the receiver actually recover back the plain text from the ciphertext? It will basically feed the ciphertext to the decryption algorithm together with the exact same key that was used for encryption. So the key that the sender used for encryption is the same key that will be used for decryption. So if you feed the ciphertext to the decryption algorithm together with the same key, you should get the exact same plain text back. Okay. Now, a few things here. The decryption algorithm in symmetric encryption is typically the reverse of the encryption algorithm. So it's actually very similar to in the encryption algorithm. Quite often, it is the same as the encryption algorithm, but in the reverse order. This is why if you feed it actually the same key, you get actually the same plain text back. The other thing is the key that is exchanged between the sender and the receiver is not part of the encryption algorithm itself. That means the encryption algorithm just tells you how to encrypt using this key. But how is the key actually exchanged between the sender and the receiver? This is not actually part of the encryption algorithm. It's actually part of a very important security topic and one that we will study in details in this course, which is called key distribution. It is actually a security field of its own, And its job is to actually exchange this key K in a very secure way between the sender and the receiver. Because obviously, if the attacker is able to obtain the key, then the attacker will be able to decrypt the ciphertext and obtain the plain text back. Okay? Symmetric encryption is typically lightweight, and it is the type of encryption that is used most widely in the world as of its invention in the 1970s. So this is the first type of encryption method that we have. The other type is called public key encryption. And public key encryption is quite different from symmetric encryption. Symmetric encryption is basically similar to the classical cryptography algorithms that we have studied in the sense that it also relies on substitution and permutation operations. However, public key encryption is different in that it relies mainly on math. So it no longer has these basic substitution and permutation operations, but it has mathematical structures that are actually difficult to break. So what is actually public key encryption or public key cryptography? Basically, you have the plain text and you feed it also to the encryption algorithm together with a key. Out comes the ciphertext. If you want to decrypt it, you feed it with the decryption algorithm together also with a key. Up to this point, it's actually the same as symmetric encryption. The difference is what is actually the key that is used. In public key cryptography, every user has a pair of keys. One is called the public key, and the other one is called the private key. Okay? The public key, from its name, is public. That means it's published. Everyone in the world can actually know it. The private key, on the other hand, is private. It is kept secret for only the user who owns it. So if this is, for example, Alice, Alice has the public key of Alice and the private key of Alice. So Alice will publish her public key and will keep her private key secret. Okay, so what is actually public key encryption? If you encrypt with one of those keys, you can only decrypt with the other. So if you encrypt with the public key of Alice, you can only decrypt with the private key of Alice. You cannot decrypt with the public key of Alice, and you cannot decrypt with the private key of someone else. So if you encrypt with the public key of Alice, you can only decrypt with the private key that is associated with this public key. What do we mean by associated with the public key? Basically, because we said that public key cryptography is based on math, there will be actually a mathematical relationship that binds the public key and the private key of each user. Okay? So it's not just two keys that are chosen at random. There is actually a mathematical relationship that will bind the public key of a user to the private key of the same user. And so, because everything is actually based on mathematical equations, if you encrypt with one key, you can only decrypt with its pair. You can only decrypt with its partner key. Okay? If you encrypt with the public key of Alice, then you can only decrypt with the private key of Alice. And if you encrypt with the private key of Alice, you can only decrypt with the public key of Alice. This is actually up to the mathematical properties of public key encryption algorithms. So, what is actually the nice thing about that? Why do we have these pair of keys? Basically, before anyone can encrypt or decrypt, they have to generate their pair of keys. They have to generate their own public key and they have to generate their partner private key. And they publish the public key and keep the private key secret, as we said. Now, because of that, no one actually has to exchange, no one has to distribute keys. The public key is already public. You can actually just publish it in a registry. And so it's not a secret. Everyone can actually see it. The private key, on the other hand, is kept secret, and no one has to distribute it. No one actually has to send it to you. You can generate it on your own using the mathematical equations of the public key cryptography algorithm. Now, what if I, as let's say Bob, wants to send a confidential message to Alice? That means Bob wants to send a message to Alice such that only Alice will be able to read it. So the message has to be kept secret from anyone except Alice. So Alice is the only one that is able to decrypt. So if we want Alice to be the only one who is able to decrypt, we have to encrypt the message with a key where the partner key belongs only to Alice. So if we want Alice to be the only one who can decrypt, then Alice has to decrypt with the private key of Alice. Okay, because this is the only key that Alice is keeping as a secret. No one else knows the private key of Alice. And so if I want Alice to be the only one who sees the message should be decryptable only by the private key of Alice. And so if I want the message to be decrypted by the private key of Alice, what should I encrypt it with? I will encrypt it with the partner key of this private key, which is the public key of Alice. So if Bob wants to send a confidential message to Alice, Bob will encrypt the message using the public key of Alice, such that when the message reaches Alice, Alice will decrypt using her private key, which she only knows. Okay? This is the confidential message. And up to this point, we have actually duplicated the function of symmetric encryption. Now we can also send confidential messages. But what if Bob sends to Alice a message encrypted with the private key of Bob? Okay, so Bob encrypts the message with his own private key. Ask yourself now, who can decrypt this message? Okay, anyone that has the possession of the public key of Bob can decrypt the message, because this is the partner key of the private key that was used in encryption. Now, who has access to the public key of Bob? The answer is everyone, because the public key of Bob is actually public. So everyone has access to this public key. And so if everyone has access to the public key, this then means that everyone can actually decrypt this message that was encrypted with the private key of Bob. So what have I gained here? Obviously, this is not a confidential message because everyone can actually decrypt it. However, what have I gained? Now look at the encryption process. The message is encrypted with the private key of Bob. Now ask yourself, who owns the private key of Bob? Who has access to the private key of Bob? The answer is no one except Bob. So if there is a message that is encrypted with the private key of Bob, then it must have been Bob who generated this message. Then even though this is not a confidential message, it is a message that actually has been authenticated. Okay? This is actually what we call a digital signature. If you want to sign a message, digitally sign a message, you encrypt it with your own private key, such that everyone can actually decrypt with your public key, which is public and everyone knows it, and verify that it must have been you who generated this message because it has your signature using your private key. It also achieves the security service that we discussed in the first lecture, which is called non-repudiation. Okay? If you encrypt a message with your own private key, no one else has this private key. Even the receiver doesn't have it. Only you have access to your own private key. So if you encrypt the message with your own private key, this is actually something that says that it must have been you who generated the message. You cannot later claim that someone else generated the message because no one else has access to your private key. Obviously, there is always the claim, well, someone stole my private key, but this is a different issue. We are referring to the case where nothing wrong has happened. It's a legitimate system. However, no one has your private key except you. And so it must have been you who generated this message. And this is the form of digital signature that achieves non-repudiation. Only public key cryptography can achieve non-repudiation. Symmetric cryptography cannot achieve non-repudiation. Why is that? If you take a look at symmetric cryptography, if you encrypt a message with the key K in symmetric cryptography, this is the only key. So who else has access to that key? The answer is the receiver. So even though only the sender and the receiver have access to the key, but basically the receiver can generate a message using the key and claim that it came from the sender. Okay? There is no way to verify that it was actually the receiver who generated this message. Whereas in public key cryptography, when you encrypt with the private key, this is a digital signature that achieves non-repudiation because only one user and only one has access to this private key. So with symmetric cryptography, you can only achieve the objective of confidentiality, whereas in public key cryptography, you can achieve confidentiality or authentication. So To achieve confidentiality, you encrypt with the public key of the receiver so that the receiver decrypts with their own private key. To achieve authentication, you encrypt with your own private key such that the receiver is able to decrypt with your own public key. Now, what if you want to have both confidentiality and authentication? The answer is that you actually have to do double encryption, meaning that first you have to generate a digital signature and encrypt the message with your own private key. Okay, encrypt the message with your own private key of Bob. And then you have to add an outer layer of encryption where you encrypt with the public key of the receiver, which is Alice in this case. So to achieve both confidentiality plus authentication, you have to do actually double encryption, where first you encrypt with your own private key, and then you encrypt again with the public key of the receiver. You can reverse the order, so you can actually encrypt with the public key of the receiver first, and then your own private key. It doesn't make a difference. But whatever you do, the decryption will be the opposite. Okay, so if you encrypt with the private key first and then you encrypt with the public key, the decryption has to go the private key of Alice first and then the public key of Bob. The decryption is always in the reverse order of the encryption. Okay? These are the main two branches of cryptography. You have symmetric encryption and public key cryptography, and we will dive deep into the details of each branch. We will start actually with symmetric encryption, and then we will go into public key cryptography. And so if public key cryptography right now sounds like voodoo, that's okay, because you will not fully understand its concept until we go into the actual mathematical details, and you will be able to see how to generate pairs of keys, how to do encryption and decryption using public key and private key and all of that. Okay, now we focus on our attention on symmetric encryption. And we start with the requirements. Let's actually now assume that we want to design a symmetric encryption system, and we want to see what are the requirements. Obviously, the first requirement is that it has to be secure. It has to be a strong encryption algorithm that is unbreakable by an attacker. Okay. The second requirement is it needs to rely on a secret, which is the symmetric key itself, that is known only to the sender and the receiver. Again, the exchange of the key itself is not part of the algorithm, but the key has to exist. There is no encryption without the key. Also, the decryption is using the same key, and it is the opposite of the encryption system. Now, a very important requirement that we have to discuss here. The algorithm itself that is used for encryption and decryption, should it be kept secret or not? I want you to actually pause the video and think about this requirement for a while. Should the encryption algorithm itself, its details, its structure, its steps, should it be secret? That means the attacker does not know it or not. The answer to this question is actually no. The encryption algorithm is always public. If it wasn't public, then there would actually be nothing to teach you in this course. I am able to teach you symmetric encryption because we all know the full details of the symmetric encryption algorithms that are out there. And this is a key requirement. You will not be able to commercially sell an algorithm unless you make it public. No one would actually trust you with their data and willingly give you full access over their data so that you can secure it with your own encryption algorithm unless you make the encryption algorithm public so that people can study it, can analyze it, can see whether it has vulnerabilities or not. And if it doesn't have vulnerabilities, at least not clear vulnerabilities, it becomes a trusted algorithm. So we have to make the encryption algorithm public in order for it to gain the trust of the public. So if we go back to the diagram of symmetric encryption, the plain text is what you encrypt. The key is obviously secret between the sender and the receiver. The encryption algorithm is a public algorithm. That means everyone knows its details, including the attacker. So when you are designing a symmetric encryption system, you should not rely on the fact that the algorithm will be a secret one. That means the only secret is the key. So the algorithm has to function securely while the algorithm itself is public. Only the key is the item that is kept secret in this case. These are the key requirements of symmetric encryption. Now, given these requirements, how do you actually attack a symmetric encryption protocol? As we said last time, there are actually two types of attacks. There is cryptanalysis and there is brute force. Brute force is the straightforward one. You basically just try all the possible variations of the key until you find the right one. And we said that how do you know when you have found the right one? It is basically when you get a message that is recognizable, whether it's in the English language or some other structure that you can recognize. And the key to the brute force attack, or for defeating the brute force attack, is to just use a large key. We said, for example, that the monoalphabetic cipher uses a key space that is 26 factorials large. This is actually a very large key space. So in the monoalphabetic cipher, brute force is not likely to succeed. Okay, so brute force attack, increase the size of the key, you have actually made brute force attack virtually impossible. The second type of attack is called cryptanalysis, and it is actually the type of attack that most attackers try to execute. Cryptanalysis doesn't actually go for trying different combinations of the key, but it is the type of attack that actually studies the algorithm, because as we said, it's public, and tries to find weaknesses in the algorithm itself, tries to find vulnerabilities, tries to find problems that the attacker can then exploit to either determine the key or decrypt and find the plain text. Okay, for example, if we go again to the monoalphabetic cipher, we know that even though the key space is very large, the algorithm is vulnerable to a specific type of cryptanalysis attack, which is called frequency analysis, basically counting the letters. And so cryptanalysis attack is the one that modern attackers try to execute. And there are actually several forms of cryptanalysis attacks depending on the severity of the attack itself. And these types of attacks depend on what kind of information the attacker has access to. For example, if the attacker only has access to ciphertext, that means the attacker only has access to text that is already encrypted, the output of the algorithm only. This is called the ciphertext only attack, and it is an attack that is unlikely to succeed because this is information that is very limited to the attacker. A strong encryption algorithm should definitely be immune against ciphertext only attacks. The second type of attack is called the known plaintext attack. The known plaintext attack is when you are sure that there is a particular message in the plaintext that is encrypted. You know where the message is and you know its corresponding ciphertext. I'll give you an example. I hope you have seen the imitation game by now. In the imitation game, they were not actually able to break the rotor machine until they discovered that there is a particular message that is embedded in every particular phrase, that is embedded in every message, which is actually Heil Hitler. And they know that it comes at the end of every message. So they take every encrypted message, each ciphertext, and they look at the last few letters, and they know that these last few encrypted letters correspond to the plain text of Heil Hitler. And so now they have a starting point to do the search. The known plain text attack can actually serve as a way to reduce the search space into the brute force. So rather than actually just randomly trying keys, a known plaintext attack can tell you this is actually the starting point. These are the set of keys that are more likely to have been used. Okay, so this is a more severe form of the cryptanalysis attack than the ciphertext attack. The one after that is called the chosen plaintext attack. The chosen plaintext attack is that if you are able to actually choose a particular plaintext message, you yourself choose it, and obtain its ciphertext. Why is this actually a serious issue? Because in some encryption algorithms, there are specific plaintext messages that are likely to produce vulnerabilities. For example, a message that is all zeros or all ones or has alternating patterns of zeros and ones or something like that. Something that the attacker chooses, such as they think that this particular choice of plaintext will lead to revealing a vulnerability in the encryption algorithm itself. Okay. The one after that is called the chosen ciphertext. This is when you have access to both encryption and decryption algorithms. So you have the freedom to choose a plaintext message and get its ciphertext, or choose a ciphertext message and get its plaintext. The availability of both makes this attack a little bit more severe because you have more access to information about how the encryption algorithm itself works and how the decryption algorithm itself works. So it gives you a higher likelihood of revealing the key. Okay. And the final type of cryptanalysis attack is called the related key attack. Basically, you observe sets of ciphertext and sets of encryptions so that you try to find patterns. You say, for example, here the text has been encrypted in a similar way, so the key that is used must have been this or that. And you start actually using these observations to narrow down the search of the key. Okay? These are the types of cryptanalysis attack that are available. And it is important to say that there is no encryption algorithm in commercial use that is what is called unconditionally secure. Unconditionally secure means that if the attacker has unlimited access to time and unlimited access to resources, they will still not be able to break the encryption algorithm. This is what an unconditionally secure algorithm is. And there is none that exists. There is no such thing as a commercial algorithm that is unconditionally secure. Okay. Instead, we go for what is called computationally secure. Computationally secure algorithm is when either the cost of breaking the cipher exceeds the value of the encrypted information, or the time required to break the cipher exceeds the useful lifetime of the information. What does this actually mean? If you have a piece of information that is worth, let's say, $5, and in order to break the cipher and retrieve this information, you have to actually have a supercomputer that does the decryptions, and it will cost you hundreds of millions of dollars. Obviously, the attacker will say, well, this is not really worth it. I will not pay hundreds of millions in order to get a piece of information that is worth $5. Okay? So in this case, the cost of breaking the cipher exceeds the value of the encrypted information itself. And so the algorithm, we say, that is actually computationally secure. Okay? Or the time required to break the cipher exceeds the useful lifetime of the information. That means the information, let's say, is useful only for 30 seconds, but it takes 35 seconds to break the cipher. Then you're okay, because after 35 seconds, we say that the information is, or after 30 seconds, we say that the information is obsolete. It's no longer useful. Okay? So if the time required to break the cipher exceeds the useful lifetime of the information, you are actually okay. It is also computationally secure. And this is actually a very important point, because if the lifetime of your information is short, then there is no need to use a very complicated encryption algorithm. A lightweight and simple encryption algorithm, even one of the classical cryptography ones, may be more appropriate in this case. Just depends on the lifetime of your information itself. Okay, this figure here shows how much time it would take to do a brute force attack given the particular size of the key. Starting with 32 bits, in old computers, even it can be broken in milliseconds. And if you go to the monoalphabetic cipher, which has 26 factorial possible numbers of keys, it will take you 6.4 times 10 to the power 6 years to do a brute force attack against this key. And this is why we say it is computationally secure in terms of brute force, but we know it is vulnerable to frequency analysis. Okay. Now, we are actually talking about symmetric encryption, and all this discussion is related to symmetric encryption. In symmetric encryption, there are actually two types of ciphers. One is called a block cipher, and one is called the stream cipher. And the difference between the two is how they take data as input. Block ciphers, from their name, they actually take data as blocks. The input to the encryption algorithm is a block of data. The minimum size is typically 64 bits. That's what the obsolete DES system used to take. AES, which is the one that we'll study in a little bit, takes actually 128 bits. And it operates on this block of data. That means all the operations are functions of this entire block. Whereas stream ciphers, they operate on a much smaller size of data, typically just 1 byte. And the structure of stream ciphers is typically very simple. You have the plain text, which is just 1 byte, okay? And you have a pseudo-random byte generator that just generates a pseudo-random byte stream. You take 1 byte that is generated by the pseudo-random byte generator, and you XOR it with the byte of plain text. Out comes the ciphertext. That's it. That's all the operation of the stream cipher. The complexity of the stream cipher is not in the, obviously not in the XOR operation, but the entire complexity relies on the pseudo-random byte generator. What is actually the meaning of pseudo-random? It means that the stream of bytes that are generated, they appear random to someone who is observing the stream. It appears only random. However, the bytes that are generated according to a structure that is determined by a key. So the key here acts as the seed to the pseudo-random byte generator. Each sequence of bytes depends on the key. And so if the receiver has the key, they will be able to generate the exact same sequence of bytes. And this is necessary if you want to obtain the plain text back. Because as we know, if A XORed with B is equal to C, then C XORed with B will be equal to A. Okay, so if this is A, this here is B, which is the pseudo-random byte stream, and this here is C. If you want to obtain A back, you have to XOR C with B. So you have to generate the exact same sequence of bytes at the receiver, and you can only do that if you have the same key. So the entire complexity of stream ciphers relies or exists in the pseudo-random byte generator itself. And we will see stream ciphers in details in the next lecture. Today, we will focus on block ciphers, which are the, let's say, the most widely used type of symmetric encryption. And block ciphers, as we said, they take actually a block of data. And so what we want to do is think about the design of block ciphers. How can we design a block cipher? How can we design a cipher that takes as input a sequence of bits and outputs a different sequence of bits, which is the ciphertext? And from now on, we will actually just be talking about bits. It's computer-based encryption. We will actually input a sequence of bits. It can be, for example, an ASCII code or an image or whatever it is. We are no longer talking about letters as in classical cryptography. We're just actually talking about bits. So we want to see how we can actually design this block cipher. A very simple and straightforward way to design a block cipher is to create something like a decoder, where you have actually a mapping between the input bits and the output bits. For example, if the block cipher that we are designing accepts 4 bits of input, okay, so it just actually has 4 bits of input, the plain text block is 4 bits, you can actually have a mapping between each possible bit of input and a bit of the output. So for example, here 0 is connected to 15, 1 is connected to 4, 2 is connected to 14 or whatever this is. Yes, 2 is connected to 14 and so on. And so if the input value is 0, 0, 0, 0, the output would be 1, 1, 1, 0. If the input value is, for example, 1, 1, 1, 0, the output would be 0, 0, 0, 0. You are actually decoding a value of the input to a value of the output. And the wiring between the input and the output defines actually this mapping. Okay, so for example, 0 is mapped to, what is it? 0 is mapped to 14. Then 0 here will be mapped to a ciphertext of 14. Okay. This is a very simple way, and it is also actually a very secure way. However, what is actually the challenge here? Consider what the receiver will do. The receiver will receive the ciphertext, the number of bits that have been mapped, and would like to actually return them back to plain text. How was the ciphertext created at the sender? Basically, using this mapping, using this table. Okay? The table contains what? Contains every possible combination of the input. If the input is 4 bits, then you have 2 power 4 possible combinations of input, which is 16. Okay? The receiver needs to know this mapping. So the receiver also needs to have these 16 possible mappings that are there. Okay? So, sorry, not 16, it's actually 4 multiplied by 2 power 4. This is actually the number of mappings that are there. Okay, so this is then the size of the key. The problem is 4 bits as input is a very small size of block. Typically, we want the block size to be minimum of 64. It's actually more desirable right now is 128. So if the block size is 64, what should be the key size? If you're using the structure, what should be the mapping? The key size should actually be 64 multiplied by 2 power 64, which is 2 power 70. This is only the size of the key. So this is a very, very large key. You cannot actually have a key size that is exchanged between sender and the receiver, and it has size 2 power 70. It's a huge size. So this ideal block cipher is not something that you can use in practice, because even though it is simple and straightforward, you cannot actually have this size of key at all. Okay. What is then the alternative? How can we design a block cipher that accepts as input a large enough block of data and still be able to decrypt this data if you have the appropriate key, and have a key that is of suitable size, also, for example, 64 bits or 128 bits, so that you can actually exchange it between sender and the receiver. This was the challenge that Claude Shannon addressed in the late 1940s and produced a paper that says that if you want to design a modern or a practical block cipher, you don't actually have to go for this decoder structure. You can actually base its architecture on combinations of operations that are substitutions and permutation. If you remember our discussion in the last lecture, we said that if a single substitution cipher is insufficient, you can actually use several substitution ciphers in cascade. Or better yet, you have one substitution followed by one transposition cipher and so on. This is actually what Claude Shannon put forth, that in order to design a modern block cipher, you have to base it on subsequent operations of substitution and permutation. Substitution is done using something called an S box, and permutation is done using something called the P box. Permutation is nothing but rearranging the bits, and substitution means that you take a group of bits and you replace them with another group of bits. So how can you design the S box and the P box? The S box and the P box have to be designed such that they achieve the security properties of confusion and diffusion. This is actually what we want to design in a block cipher. We want the design to achieve confusion and diffusion. So how do we design S box and P box that achieve confusion and diffusion? Basically, diffusion means that the statistical structure of the plain text is distributed over a bulk of ciphertext. Let's say, for example, your plain text is 128 bits. Each group of bits in the plain text has to affect a bigger group of bits in the ciphertext. Okay? Again, I would say that each group of bits in the plain text, for example, if you take 8 bits in the plain text, those 8 bits should affect a larger group of bits in the ciphertext. That means each byte in the ciphertext should be dependent on a group of bytes in the plain text as well. Why is that? Such that if there are patterns that are available in the plain text, they are dissipated, they are distributed, they are diffused into the bits of the ciphertext, such that even if there are bits in the plain text, you will not recognize the same patterns in the ciphertext. This is what is called diffusion. That means, for example, if you input to the block cipher plain text that is all zeros or all ones or alternating patterns of zeros and ones, a good encryption algorithm will create diffusion. That means that these patterns will be diffused over the structure of the ciphertext. They will be dissipated. They will be hidden in the bytes or in the bits of the ciphertext itself. This is diffusion. Confusion means that the relationship between the ciphertext and the key is so complicated that you will not be able to figure out the key by studying patterns in the ciphertext. That means you want actually the encryption to be strong enough, you want it to be confusing enough, such that you will not be able to figure out the key given your analysis of the ciphertext itself. So we want to be able to do substitution and permutation such that we achieve confusion and diffusion. If we do that, we will be able to design a block cipher that is practical and can use actually a limited key size. Okay, so how do we then design a block cipher that is able to do confusion and diffusion? There has been actually several structures over the years. One of the classical ones is a structure or an architecture of a block cipher that is called the Feistel cipher. And it is important to note that the Feistel cipher is not an actual encryption algorithm. It is actually a concept. It is an architecture. It is a guideline. If you follow it, you will actually have a good block cipher. And there has been encryption algorithms over the years that have been used quite widely in practice that are actually designed based on the Feistel architecture or the Feistel cipher. An example is the DES algorithm. As we said, it was used from the 1970s until the late 1990s. The DES algorithm is actually a Feistel cipher, a structure of a Feistel algorithm. Okay, so what is this Feistel cipher? What is it supposed to do? Basically, you take as input a group of bits. This is your plain text. Whatever the number of bits that you take, you divide them into two halves. So for example, let's say you take as a group of input 64 bits, you divide them into 32 bits and 32 bits. Okay, this is called the right half, and this is called the left half. Okay, what do you do after that? You take the right half and you feed it into what is called the round function. Now, the round function depends on how you will design the Feistel cipher. As we said it's just a guideline. So in the Feistel cipher itself, the round function is not defined. You have to define it. So in DES, for example, the round function is something that is based on permutation and a substitution. Okay, you are actually free to design any round function that you want. So you pass the right half of plain text to the round function together with what is called a round key. What is actually the round key? Basically, just like any block cipher, you have to have a key K that is exchanged in advance between the sender and the receiver. The sender and the receiver exchange only one key, but they have an algorithm that is called the key schedule that generates round keys based on the original key. So using one key, which is K, you are able to generate K1, K2, K3, K4, and as many round keys as you want, equal to the number of rounds or the number of iterations where you will actually repeat this algorithm. So again, what we have done so far, we have taken the right half of plain text, we have fed it into the round function together with a round key that is generated based on the symmetric key K. The output of this round function is then XORed with the left half of plain text. So here you see the left half is XORed with the right half that has been passed to the round function with the key K. The output of this XOR becomes a new right half, and the left half is actually just the right half of the previous round. So you take RE0, that becomes LE1. RE1 is actually just LE0 XORed with the result of the round function itself. Now this here is the output of the first round. You basically, in the Feistel cipher, you just keep repeating that for as many rounds as you want. Obviously, the more rounds you have, the more secure the algorithm will become. How many rounds should you have? This is actually a design issue. For example, in DES, if I remember correctly, it was 10 or 12 rounds. I really don't remember the number, but it was a fixed and specific number of rounds. You can actually have any number of rounds based on the design of the algorithm. Okay, but as you see, the structure of each round is exactly the same. So you can actually implement it in hardware only once and have something like a loop going on to repeat the same operation over and over until you are done with the number of rounds, where the input to every round is actually the output of the round before. So the input to round 2 is the output of round 1, and the input to round 3 is the output of round 2, and so on. What do you actually see as the operations done in every round? Basically, we have a substitution function, which is the round function f, and the substitution is dependent on the key. So it's not just a static substitution. If the key is changed, the substitution also changes. So you have a substitution function, which is the round function f, and you have also a permutation function, which is switching the left half with the right half. So effectively, what the Feistel cipher does is that it does substitution and permutation in sequence. You do substitution based on the round function. You do permutation based on shifting the right half with the left half. And you do this repeatedly in rounds so that you achieve confusion and diffusion. So diffusion is achieved because with the rounds, you actually have each block of plain text. It becomes dependent because you do actually the round function based only on the right half, and then you XOR it with the left half. So in every round, you are actually XORing the right half with the left half. So you are actually causing each byte of plain text to be affected or to affect several bytes of ciphertext in this case. And it achieves diffusion because you actually have several rounds of substitution and permutation, and so it will be difficult to guess the key given only access to the ciphertext. This is actually the last round. As an additional permutation step, you exchange again the left half with the right half, and this then becomes your ciphertext. Now, as we said, this is only an architecture, it's only a design. What actually determines whether this design is good or not? Basically, the block size. How many bits are you actually given as input? The larger the number of bits, the more secure the algorithm is. But also, if you increase the number of bits, the algorithm becomes slower. So a 64-bit algorithm is faster than 128, and this one is faster than 256, and so on. So security always comes at the price. If you increase security, you always or usually decrease speed, or you have more overhead or something like that. The key size is also an important factor. The larger the key, again, the more secure the algorithm is, but usually it will also be slower. The number of rounds is also a factor. The more rounds you have, the more secure the algorithm is, but you have guessed it, it's also slower in this case because you have to go through a larger number of rounds. Also, the function that generates the round keys is an important factor. If you have a simple function that generates round keys, then the algorithm becomes vulnerable to an attack. If you have a sophisticated or a strong function that generates a round key, it is then robust. The round function itself, the function f, is also important. What is actually this function? Is it a simple function? Is it a sophisticated substitution function? This is then actually becomes a factor. How can you actually implement it? If you can implement it in hardware, that makes it faster. And if it is easy to analyze, if it has patterns, for example, or vulnerabilities, then it becomes vulnerable to a cryptanalysis attack. What you see here in this figure is the encryption algorithm. The decryption, as we said before, works in the exact opposite. So if this is the encryption, you end up with this ciphertext. If you want to decrypt, you take the last operation, which is the output of 16, okay? And you pass it through the exact operations but in reverse. And if you are doing it in reverse, then you are actually using the round keys in reverse. So the first round key that you use in the decryption algorithm was actually the last round key that you used in encryption. Okay? The second one that you use, which is K15, was the one before the last in decryption. So you are actually repeating the same operation. The exact same round function is used. XOR is used again. Same permutation step in every round. Same number of rounds overall for decryption. Same round keys, but used in reversed order such that you are actually able to obtain the plain text back at the end. Okay. This is actually the Feistel structure. It was the most popular structure that is used to build block ciphers for a long period of time until the late 1990s when the DES algorithm became obsolete and it wasn't used anymore, and it was replaced by the new or the newer algorithm, which is the Advanced Encryption Standard, or AES. The design of AES is not actually based on the Feistel cipher. So it's not actually a Feistel architecture. It depends on another algorithm, which is actually an iterative algorithm, not one that has these a mirror structure of Feistel. It was designed actually based on a competition. The competition was held in the late 90s, and one of these proposals won the competition, and then it became the seed for the advanced encryption standard. The algorithm was called the Riemann-Damon algorithm. These are actually the names of the two scientists that designed it. And as we said, it's an iterative algorithm. The structure of the algorithm itself is shown on the right-hand figure. And again, it has a number of rounds, but the number of rounds actually don't work on the left half and right half of data as in Feistel. It works on a matrix. Okay. The number of rounds actually has options. So the number of rounds can either be 10, 12, or 14, and it depends on the key size. So the key size also has options. The minimum size is 128. It can also be 192, and it can be 256. So AES provides you with some options. You can use a small key space of 128. Obviously, the algorithm will be faster, especially that it will have only 10 rounds. But this is actually right now is not considered very secure. The standard one that is used right now is 256, where you have actually 14 rounds. Okay, so what is actually the Riemann-Damon algorithm? You take the block of plain text, which is standard. It's always 128 bits. So the number of rounds change, the size of the key changes. But the size of the plain text is always 128 bits. So you take 128 bits, you divide them into blocks of bytes. So 128 bits divided by 8, that gives you 16 bytes. And you put these 16 bytes in a matrix that is 4 by 4. So in this 4 by 4 matrix, every cell is 1 byte. Okay, so you have a 4 by 4 matrix of bytes. This matrix is the one that you will operate on. It's called the state matrix. And after each operation, the content of the matrix, the contents of the matrix changes. And so the state matrix changes. And it keeps doing that after each round. So the input state, or the plain text, which is 16 bytes divided into 4 by 4 matrix, gets an initial transformation based on a round key. Okay, and then it gets passed into rounds. In each round, there are repetitive operations of substitution and permutation that happen on the state matrix, changing the contents of the matrix itself until you actually reach the final state matrix, which is also obviously equal to 16 bytes or 128 bits, and this becomes your ciphertext. In each round, you get a round key. Okay. The round key is taken from the original key. The original key is passed into something called a key expansion algorithm, and the key expansion algorithm just basically generates the round keys. The round keys also have 128 bits, even though the size of the original key itself can be 128, 192, or 256. However, the size of the key just actually is a factor of the number of rounds. So if you have a larger key, then you use it actually to generate more round keys for the larger number of rounds, but each round key is always 128 bits. Okay. Now let's open this black box and see what the AES algorithm contains. Let's actually see what each round contains. So you get the plain text, and as we saw in this figure, there is an initial confirmation that is a function of the round key. The initial transformation is nothing actually but an XOR operation, as we will see in a little bit. You XOR the plain text with the first round key. Okay, and then you pass it to the first round, and each round consists of 4 operations. The operations are actually stable or fixed. These are substitute bytes, shift rows, mix columns, add round key. Each round consists of the same 4 operations except of the very last rounds. The very last round consists only of 3 operations, which are substitute bytes, shift rows, and add round key. Mix columns is the one that you don't find in the last round. Okay? So you have, obviously, this is the case when you have only 10 rounds, and this is the case when the key is only 128 bits. This is the one that I will be explaining in this lecture. And in every round, the round key is added to the last step. Okay, so the add round key phase is the one that is added in the last step. So just like any block cipher, AES aims to achieve confusion and diffusion. And we said that confusion and diffusion are achieved by subsequent operations of substitution and permutation. And this is exactly what you see here. Substitute bytes is a substitution operation. Shift rows and mix columns are permutation operations. And add round key is another substitution operation. You have 2 substitutions and 2 permutations in every round, and you repeat the rounds for a number of times. The decryption algorithm is the same operations but in reverse. But as you will see here, the decryption algorithm is not identical to the encryption algorithm. And this is one of the problems of the AES algorithm. As you see here, in the decryption, you start also with add round key, but then you have inverse shift rows. Inverse shift rows is not the same operation as shift rows, as you will see. Inverse subbytes is not the identical operations to subbytes. Okay, it relies on a different matrix. It could be the reverse operation, but it is not an identical operation. In the Feistel cipher, the decryption was actually identical to the encryption algorithm, but used the round keys in reverse. The advantage of that is that if they are actually identical, you can use the same hardware for both encryption and decryption, but you just reverse the order of the round keys. This is not the case in AES. the decryption is not identical to the encryption. You have to use a different shift rows, different sub bytes, different mix columns in the encryption and decryption to be able to reverse the operations. So the decryption is not identical to the encryption process. Okay. Now let's take a look at each one of these operations in each round, and we'll start with sub bytes, so substitute bytes or byte substitution. Basically, you take the state matrix, which is the 4x4 matrix where every cell contains a byte, and you substitute each cell or the byte in each cell with another group of bytes. And the substitution is done based on a table that is called the S box, where each cell, because it contains 8 bits or 1 byte, it is actually converted to hexadecimal or a hexadecimal value. So each 4 bits are converted to their hexadecimal equivalent. And the 2 hexadecimal values are used as an index to the S box, the substitution box, to determine the substitution. For example, if I want to substitute EA, I will take E as the index to the row. I will take A as the index to the column, and the intersection of these two is 87. So EA is replaced with 87. Okay. Then if I want to encrypt 04, I will go to row 0, column 4, and the result is F2. So 04 is replaced with F2. 65, 6 is the row, 5 is the column. The intersection of these two is 4D, and so 65 is replaced with 40. So on. You take each cell in the matrix, each byte, and you replace it with another group of bytes. Okay, and you keep doing that. If you want to decrypt, you see now it is not an identical table, so you cannot use the S box for decryption. You have to use something called the inverse S box. It is basically the inverse of the S box. And it is the same operation. So if you want to decrypt 87, you go to the column marked 8, the row marked 8, the column marked 7, and the intersection of the two will be EA. You see, this is actually the value that you started with. If you want to decrypt F2, you go to the row marked F, column marked 2, the result will be 04. The inverse S box acts as something that inverts the operation of the S box. And so obviously it is not identical. So if you want to reverse the substitution operation, you have to use a different matrix. That's why we say it cannot be implemented in hardware. You cannot use the same hardware for encryption and decryption because the S box and the inverse S box are different. Now, the question that we want to ask ourselves here is, how is the S box actually designed? It is not just a random substitution of bits, actually. It is designed with some key objectives. Basically, you want to have a substitution box that creates more confusion and diffusion. You want to be able actually to hide the relationship between the input and the output. And so the substitution box is created with a key objective, which is that there is a low correlation between the input bits and the output bits. And there are actually a few properties. First of all, there are no fixed points. Fixed points means that substitution of A results in A. So for example, you try to substitute, let's say, the value EA, and you end up with EA. This is what would be called a fixed point, and there should be no fixed point. There is, of course, no fixed points in the S box of AES. There is also no opposite fixed points. So an opposite fixed point is that if you encrypt or you substitute A and you get A dash, where A dash is the bitwise complement of A. So ones and zeros become zeros and ones. This is an opposite fixed point, and there is no opposite fixed points in the S box of AES. Another property is that the S box obviously must be invertible. So the inverse S box, you see here, inverts the operations of the S box. So the S box itself must be invertible. And it would only be invertible if there are no two cells that actually have the same value. Okay? Every substitution is actually unique. There are no two substitutions or more that would actually result in the same value. If this is the case, then it would not be invertible. So the S box must be invertible. That means that if you pass the output of the S box to the inverse S box, you will end up with the original input. However, even though it is invertible, the S box does not self-inverse. That means if you pass the input A to the S box, it is not equal to the same input passed to the inverse S box. Again, if you pass, let's say, 95 to the S box and you pass 95 to the inverse S box, you will not get the same result. So S box of 95 equal to A, but IS box of 95 is equal to AD. These two values are not equal, obviously. So these are the key properties that you have in the design of the S box so that you would decrease the correlation between the input and the output. No fixed points, no opposite fixed points, invertible, but does not self-inverse. Okay. The second operation in every round is called shift rows. So after you substitute the bytes, you take the result of the substitution and you pass it to shift rows. Shift rows is an operation that is done on the row. What do? You take the first row and you don't do anything to it. It is unchanged. Okay, so the first row of the state matrix is unchanged. The second row, you do a circular shift by one position. That means you shift the bytes by one position to the left, and the one that is leftmost gets shifted to the rightmost position. The third row is shifted also circularly to the left, but by two positions. So S23 goes here, this goes here, this actually goes here, and this goes there. Okay. The last row is also circularly shifted by three positions. What is actually the rationale here? Think about what we're actually doing. First, we substituted each byte. So the operations in substitute bytes are per cell. Shift rows is an operation to an entire row, and it is not the same operation in every row. So this is now substitution followed by permutation. After that, you go into another permutation. It's a combination actually of substitution and permutation, which is mixed columns. Mixed columns is nothing actually but a matrix multiplication. You multiply the state matrix by a fixed matrix, which you see here. It's fixed. That means it's not dependent on the key or anything. It's actually fixed in all operations. And by the way, the S box and the shift rows are fixed in all operations. They are not dependent on the key. If we actually go back to the structure, you'll see that in each round, the only operation that is dependent on the key is add round key. This is the only one that is dependent on the key. Substitute bytes is stable, shift rows is stable, mixed columns is stable. Only the add round key functions depend on the key. That means you are doing substitution, permutation, then a combination of substitution and permutation, which is mixed columns, and then finally you add the round key. Okay. Now, mixed columns is a matrix multiplication. What is its intention? The intention or the objective of mixed columns is that the result of this matrix multiplication is that every byte will be dependent on all the other bytes in the column. Okay? Each byte in the state matrix is replaced by a value that is dependent on all 4 bytes in the column. How is that? Let's take as an example S0, S-0.j. 0 and j are actually the row and column, so it's row 0 and column j. So let's say we are actually talking about S00. That means the cell in the 00 position. This is actually 2, which is this value, multiplied by S00, XORed with 3, multiplied by S10, okay, XORed with S20, XORed with S3 and 0. So you see that S00 in the output, which is this value here, depends on S00, S10, S20, and S30. If you remember when we were talking about diffusion, we said that the goal of diffusion is to dissipate the statistical structures of the plain text. This is exactly what is happening here. We are actually taking each byte in the plain text or in the input to mixed columns, and you are replacing it by a value that is dependent on all the 4 bytes in the column. So the output is something that is not dependent on a single cell in the state matrix, but actually an entire column. So if we review what we did in each round, substitute bytes, one cell replaced by a value that is dependent only on a single cell. Shift rows is something that depends only on the row. So you shift only on the row. Mixed columns depends on the column. So shift rows followed by mixed columns, that means you have done a permutation and substitution based on the row and column. And then finally, the add round key is something that is a bitwise XOR based on the column. So you take a column of the state matrix and you XOR it with a column of the key. Okay, so you take the round key, you divide it into columns, and you do a bitwise XOR that is column-wise. By the way, in the mixed columns, if you want to invert, so in the decryption process, you have to also do a multiplication, but the multiplication is by actually the inverse matrix in this case. So it's also not an identical matrix, it's the inverse. This is actually not the inverse matrix, this is the multiplication matrix, but there is an inverse matrix that you have to multiply with. Okay, this is then the summary of an AES round. You take the state matrix, you substitute the bytes, you end up with a new state matrix. You shift the rows, you end up with a new state matrix. You mix the columns. Now every byte of the state matrix depends on the columns, and then you add round key, and then you end up with a new state matrix that becomes the input to the next round. And you repeat all that. The only round that is different is the very last round, which does not have the mixed columns step. Okay. Last thing we will discuss in this lecture and in AES is the key expansion algorithm. Basically, you take as input the key, which can have size 128, 192, or 256, and you want to use it to generate round keys. I will only discuss the case of the 128 bits. The algorithm is actually a simple one. You take the 128 bits and you copy it into a state matrix. Okay, so now you have 128 bits. You use the first 128 bits to generate the next 128 bits, and then the next 128 bits are used to generate the following 128 bits, and so on. Okay, how do you generate the round keys? It's basically this algorithm. You take each column and you convert, and this then becomes a word. So K0, K1, K2, and K3, these are actually the bytes of the original key. And this becomes W0. You pass them to an algorithm, which is G. G is basically, first of all, a permutation operation similar to shift rows, followed by a substitution operation that is actually exactly using the S box, the same S box. And then after you substitute the bytes of the key, you do an XOR operation that may or may not be present in every round. This final XOR operation has a schedule. So you have the 10 rounds of AES. Each one, you may or may not actually have an XOR operation as you see here. If there is an XOR operation, you are actually XORing with a specific value that depends on the round. Okay, and then the output of this algorithm becomes W4. If you want to generate W5, it's actually W1 XORed with W4. W6 is XORed with W5, W7 is XORed with W6, and so on. And so every word is a function of the word before it. Okay? This is actually the key expansion algorithm. Okay? Final thing is that there is actually a decryption algorithm that is identical to the encryption algorithm. However, it's not straightforward. So it's mathematically identical, but its structure is a little bit different. Something that I just put it there for information, and you can just actually read about it in the book. I will actually end this lecture with a video that summarizes how the AES algorithm works, and I will comment the video on the video as we see it together. So as you see here, it's the Rijndael encryptor, which is AES. You take a block of plain text and a block of ciphertext. The plain text is actually, sorry, the plain text is put into a state matrix, as you see here on the left. And you also start with the key. Let's actually assume that the key is 128 bits. The key is also put into a state matrix. The state matrix passed to the encryption process, and the key is passed to the key expansion algorithm. Here are actually the overall process. You take the state matrix, you pass it to the round key together with the first round key, of course. You do sub bytes, shift rows, mix columns for 10 rounds, and the 10th round is a little bit different. There are 4 types of transformations, as we have seen, and now we will illustrate them. Sub bytes, as we see, you take each byte as an index to the row and column. So you take 1, for example, that defines the row, 9 defines the column, and the result is D4. And use that as the modification to the state matrix. And so the output of sub bytes is a new state matrix. You take that and you pass it to shift rows. Shift rows, you take the first row, you leave it as it is. Second row is rotated over 1 byte. Third row rotated 2 bytes. Final row rotated 3 bytes. Okay. You pass that to mix columns, which is a matrix multiplication. And the result of that is that each value in the output will depend on an entire column of input, as we see here. After the mix columns, you have actually the add round key, and it is a column-wise XOR operation. So you take a column of the round key, you XOR it with a column of the state matrix, and this then becomes your output, and this then passes to the second round. You do that for 9 additional rounds, as you see here. You will see now that round 10 doesn't have the mix column step. And so this becomes your output or the ciphertext that you can send to the receiver. Last thing is the key schedule. So you start with the original key, which is 128 bits. You copy it to the first 128 bits of the round key. This actually becomes your first round key. First operation is that you rotate word. You do the sub bytes using SBox. You XOR it with the first word, and then this becomes the next column of the round key. And then after that, you do actually the XORing operation. And then you just repeat. There are some rows where you will actually add the first row is the one that the first column is the one that you do the rotation and substitution operations, and then it's just the XOR operations. And you do that repeatedly to generate the 10 round keys. That's it. If you have any questions, we will discuss it in our next interactive sessions. Thank you very much.